So, we're diving into this political mystery you sent my way about Eritrea and
Right.
their cabinet vanishing.
Yeah.
It's wild. This BBC article by Martin Plaut really lays it all out there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation where you start to kind of think about, how power really functions, even in systems that seem like they're pretty straightforward on paper. You have a
Mm.
cabinet, they make these big decisions.
Right.
But in Eritrea, it seems like they've gone totally silent.
Totally. And their last meeting, according to this article, was September 29th, 2018,
Wow.
which that's over 6 years ago. What happens when such a vital part of a government just goes silent for years? What's the impact?
Or just imagine like a company, right, where the board of directors just decides we're not going to meet anymore.
Right.
Like no more strategic decisions, no oversight, just complete radio silence. That's essentially what we're seeing in Eritrea. And this article kind of hints at some possible reasons why. And one name that keeps popping up is Abraham Afwerki,
Oh.
the son of President Isaias Afwerki.
So the article mentions that Abraham was actually at that last cabinet meeting back in 2018. Is that a big deal?
Well, it's definitely something to pay attention to because former Ambassador Abdullah Adam actually suggests that Abraham being there caused some friction and that might have contributed to the cabinet just kind of coming to a standstill.
Hmm.
And you have to remember that around that time, his visibility was already increasing, especially during that whole Eritrea-Ethiopia peace agreement, which was a huge deal for the region.
Right.
So people were already kind of whispering, what's his role? What's going on? And then he shows up at this big meeting. It's like, okay, something's up.
Yeah. So we've got a cabinet that stopped meeting. We've got these whispers about the president's son potentially kind of pulling strings in the background.
Yeah.
It all feels very like behind the curtain, you know?
Yeah. And that lack of transparency, that's a huge part of this story.
Mm.
The article even suggests that President Isaias might be doing this on purpose, sidelining the cabinet so he can just consolidate his own power.
Interesting.
And by removing that whole decision-making layer, he's basically operating without any checks and balances.
And if we're looking back historically at President Isaias, the article really digs into this. He's kind of known for this, right? Like
Yeah.
using cabinet reshuffles to push out rivals and hold on to power, and he's been doing it for decades.
And that's a really important point.
Mm-hmm.
We have to remember, this isn't just about a few missed meetings,
Yeah.
This is part of a much bigger pattern of how power has worked in Eritrea for a very long time.
Right, so it's like a feature, not a bug.
Exactly.
Okay, so maybe the president is consolidating control, but there's another layer here too, right? Like, what about the cabinet members themselves? Because the article paints this picture of this aging leadership, and it doesn't really seem like there's a plan for the future.
Oh, absolutely. And the article straight up says many ministers are in their 70s and 80s.
Wow.
Some have been there for over 30 years.
Yeah.
And listen, I'm not saying long tenures are bad, but the issue here is that there's zero succession planning.
Yeah.
Like there's no process in place for when these leaders are too old to serve anymore. Like who takes over?
It's like they haven't thought about what happens when they retire.
That's right.
So it's not even just about who's in charge right now, but it's about what happens next. And based on this article, what happens next is a total question mark.
Yeah, it's a very uncertain future. And it's a future that has some very real consequences for Eritrea and its people.
Hmm.
I mean, we're not just talking about political theory here. This is about stability,
Yeah.
about the well-being of everyday Eritreans.
This is where it gets really worrying for me because the article mentions that some people are forgetting these cabinet members even exist. It's like a whole part of the government just fading away.
Right. It's like a system that's so deeply rooted, and yet it's showing these cracks and this whole leadership void. It goes beyond the cabinet meetings, too, because the article mentions the Ministry of Defense basically being leaderless since 2013.
Wow, a country without a clear leader for its defense. That's kind of terrifying, honestly. How does that even happen?
Well, it's kind of wild. The previous defense minister was General Siphat Ephraim, and he got moved to head the Ministry of Energy and Minerals, but the article says no one officially took his old job.
Oh, wow.
And it gets even more complicated because the Ministry of Energy and Minerals is basically vacant, too, because General Ephraim hasn't been able to serve due to health issues.
Right.
So you've got these two major ministries, both without clear leadership for years.
It's like a domino effect of vacancies. Are there other examples of this in other ministries?
Yeah, the article also talks about the Education Ministry. Minister Samir Rusum has been absent since March 2022. So a bunch of lower-ranking officials are kind of running things. And then there's the Ministry of Regional Administration, headed by Wolde Mikel Abraha.
Mm-hmm.
He's the oldest-serving minister. And the article says he hasn't been seen publicly in years.
So let me get this straight. We've got an absent cabinet, potentially vacant ministries, and a president who's been in charge for decades. It all sounds incredibly vulnerable. So what does all of this mean for Eritrea's future?
Well, the article kind of presents these two contrasting views from former Ambassador Abdullah Adam and Dr. Aden.
Okay.
Abdullah's argument is that President Isaias is doing this on purpose, sidelining the cabinet to avoid anyone holding him accountable and just solidifying his control.
Which, honestly, based on what we've talked about with his track record, wouldn't be surprising.
Right. But Dr. Aden has a slightly different take. He thinks that while the president might be behind the lack of succession planning, he doesn't blame the ministers themselves. He emphasizes their past service to Eritrea, their patriotism.
So two different ways of looking at the same situation, each with their own interpretation of the motivations behind it. All sounds pretty impossible to predict the future of Eritrea with so many unknowns.
Exactly. And while those two perspectives see things differently, they both agree on one major thing. Eritrea desperately needs a new generation of leaders ready to take the reins. The problem is there's no system in place to make that happen.
It's like they're just crossing their fingers, hoping for the best, but not actually dealing with the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so risky. The article even points out how different this is from Eritrea's neighbors, Ethiopia and Sudan. They've both gone through these periods of intense political turmoil, and Eritrea has kind of avoided that.
Right. It's like a reminder that even though they've had this kind of stability, they're not immune to what's going on around them. This isn't just an internal Eritrea thing. This could impact the whole region.
Exactly. It has implications for the entire Horn of Africa, and that's why this whole deep dive into Eritrea's cabinet disappearing is so important.
Right.
It shows us the challenges that come up not just in Eritrea, but in tons of countries with leaders who are getting older and no clear plan for who's next.
It's a pattern we see again and again.
It is, and it highlights how crucial it is to have systems in place for that peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah,
Making sure countries can handle leadership changes without everything falling apart.
absolutely. So it seems like we're looking at this ticking clock here. Does the article offer any solutions? Like, what needs to happen to avoid a full-blown crisis?
Well, both Abdullah and Dr. Aden, even with their different viewpoints, they actually agree on one big thing. Eritrea needs some new blood,
Okay.
fresh perspectives, new ideas to deal with these really complicated problems. They say a new generation of leaders equipped to handle 21st century issues that's crucial for Eritrea's future.
Makes sense, but like we've been talking about, the big hurdle is making space for those new voices. How do you actually make that happen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is, and it makes you think about how can we make sure that governments aren't just built for today, but for tomorrow too? Because to create a peaceful and prosperous future for any country, you need leaders who are committed to transparency, accountability, and nurturing the next generation. And that's what makes this such a thought-provoking deep dive, don't you think?
Absolutely. It reminds us that the choices made today have a ripple effect on the future. And understanding those choices, like we've tried to do here, that's the first step towards creating a better tomorrow.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This was a great conversation. Thanks for breaking it all down with me.
Anytime, glad we could dig into this.